فاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الرحمن الرحيم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله الذي لا يبلغ مدحته القائلون ولا يحصي نعماءه العادون ولا يعد حقه المجتهدون الذي لا يدركه بعد الهمم ولا يناله غوث الفتن الذي ليس لصفته حد محدود ولا نعت موجود ولا وقت معدود ولا أجل ممدود فترى الخلائق بقدرته ونشر الرياح برحمته. اللهم عفس لك سلواتك وسلامة تصريماتك على أفضل التعينات المفاضة من العماء رباني وعاقل التنزلات المضافة إلى نوع الإنساني. كان الله ولم يكن معه شيء ثاني محصي لعوالم حضرات الخاص في وجوده وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام المبين الرسول النبي المكي المدني القرشي التحامي صاحب لواء الحمد ومقام المحمود عبد القاسم محمد الحميد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى عطيه وابن عمه وخليفته من بعده وقائد الغر المحجلين يا صديقين إمام المتقين أمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى ابنته الطاهرة الحوراء العنسية الراضية المرضية الشفية يوم الجزاء فاطمة الزهراء سلام الله عليها.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى سبتي الرحمة وسيدي شباب أهل الجنة الحسن والحسين. اللهم صل على أئمة المسلمين علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد وحسن بن علي وحجة القائم المنتظر المهدي.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
حججك على عبادك وعملائك في بلادك. اللهم سهل منهجهم وعجل في فرجهم وجعلنا من محبيهم ومواليهم وشيعتهم ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من يومنا هذا إلى قيام يوم الدين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. صلوات على محمد وعلى محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Please recite the Surah Fatiha for the soul of Marhum Sayyid Amir Shah Hassan Yar. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. I begin in the name of Allah, the most beneficent and most merciful. We thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who has granted us this tawfiq, that we are commemorating, contemplating, reflecting, learning and reminding ourselves of our duty as believers, especially reminding ourselves of those occasions which are defining moments in the history of Islam, like the birth of the beloved daughter of Amirul Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib, Hazrat Zainab Salamullahi alayha.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Her birth coincides with the International Day for Women. So this week is also International Day for Women, and Hazrat Zainab represents an ideal woman whom Islam has presented, who manifested the teachings of Holy Prophet and Ahlul Bayt and proved to society, to mankind, that being a woman is not a defect. Being a woman does not mean you are at disadvantage if you are a believer, if you are a Muslim. This is very important during the times in which we are living, where Islam is being ridiculed and attacked from every direction, not because Islam cannot answer, but because some people are feeling very, very threatened by the emergence of Islam, because it is a religion which provides solutions of today. And as a result of that, we find even the notion of women in Islam is being talked about as if Islam does not recognize the status of women. Islam believes in gender superiority, and for Islam everything means men and women are like second-class citizens, whereas that is not the true case. They are role models that have not been presented, and we are not doing our duty as believers to spread the message of the true Islam, the Islam that was brought by Rasulullah and it was propagated by Ahlul Bayt. And that's why we find such role models which are completely contrary, completely against Islamic values or against Islamic principles. They come and they are presented by those who are trying to undermine Islam, whereas those who really believe in Islam sometimes are lagging behind in presenting their idea. What is the outcome? What is the result? I was recently in this program of the birth of Holy Prophet, and in the program, randomly, the person who was organizing the program, he called upon some children and asked, "Who is your role model?" So the child stood up, and probably the person who was organizing was expecting, because it is lakum fi rasulillahi uswatun hasana, so the child would rise up and say, the Prophet of Allah. But the child stood up and he said, "My role model is Martin Luther King." It is not bad that Martin Luther King could be a role model, but Islam has far more superior role models which are not being presented to these children. And the lives of those who have given everything that they had for Islam is not being brought forth and not being presented to our children, so that they could take them as role models and make their lives a path that they would traverse or move on through the lives of those great people who have served Islam. And today I would like to use the life of Hazrat Zainab Salamullah Alaiha, who was a role model not only for men, not only for women, but also for men. Because that's another argument that is posed all the time, that Islam talks a lot about men, but what about women? But the argument that mutakallimin, our ulama, they talk about, our scholars, they talk about is the traits, the virtues, or the traits that we acquire as human beings, they are not acquired by our body, but that rather they are acquired by our soul. It is, the beneficiary is not our body. Our soul is the beneficiary. The body is gender specific. The body of a person could be that of a male or a female. but the soul does not possess gender. The soul is gender free. So all the qualities, good or bad, they are being acquired by our soul. So if today the trait that I'm talking about today is bravery, shuja'a, fearlessness, not having any fear. This trait is associated with men in general. Everybody thinks, or most of us think, that only men can be shaji, men could be brave, and they can demonstrate their shuja'a in the battlefield. They go in the battlefield and present themselves and fight the enemy, and so that is the manifestation of their bravery. But the argument is that bravery as a trait in itself resides in the soul of a person, not in his body. And if you take that, then you will see suddenly you do not have to fight in a battlefield to be brave. There are so many brave men who were able to accomplish a lot of great things without going to battlefield at all, through non-violent means. In our time today, just like Martin Luther King, or for that matter Mandela, or for that matter Gandhi, these people were very, very brave. However, they did not draw any sword or any weapon to go and fight the enemy. They were stuck, or they were steadfast on the convictions and the beliefs that they had, and they were willing to take all kinds of calamities and hardships that they have to confront to make sure that their cause is promoted. Therefore, first thing that we want to first take out from our discussion is you do not have to go to battlefield to fight battles. It is metaphorically said. It is one of the forms of showing your bravery. There are other ways where men can be brave. Similarly, women can show their bravery. Their bravery do not have to be demonstrated by going physically into the battlefield, but rather sticking to the principles and convictions that they had without falling into the state of hopelessness. That is the bravery of women. Especially from the place that I grew up in India, and women, or the history of women, is filled with oppression and injustice in India, whether it is from the enemies or even from the loved ones. The society, the culture is not conducive to promote and nurture women like the way the Prophet of Islam or Islam promoted and nurtured women. The way the Prophet of Allah would rise up to respect Fatima and make her sit in his own place. You do not see that kind of a culture back in India, where the Hindu mythology presented women to be inferior. As a result of that, when there used to be battles in the past, when men would fall in the battlefield, women would go and kill themselves by falling into the wells, and their wells would be filled with the bodies of women because they have committed suicide, because they think it's not worth living anymore and they are not going to withstand the humiliation, and so they are so hopeless that they go and kill themselves. Whereas when you look at Islam, life is the most precious thing, and people who kill themselves are not the ones who are brave, those who can withstand the hardships of time, those who can confront the difficulties of time and still come out with their beliefs and with their convictions. They are the ones who would prevail. And this is shown and this is demonstrated by Hazrat Zainab Salamullah Alayha in Karbala. We see the bravery of Imam Hussein. We see the bravery of the Ashab and Ansar of Imam Hussein on one side. But when the Ashura ends, now who is the bravest amongst Ahlul Bayt? It is Zainab. Her bravery is demonstrated in her obedience to the Imam of the time. She comes to Imam Zainul Abidin and asks, while Imam is in the state of unconsciousness, wakes him up and says that, Sajjad, you are the Imam of the time. Order us. Tell us what is our duty right now. Should we die staying in the tents which are being burned, or should we save our lives? Here Zainab is demonstrating whether even you are on the verge of dying, your duty as a believer is to listen to the command of the Imam of the time. And Imam Sajjad says that it is our duty to save our lives. O Aunt Zainab, let us all leave the firing tents. And from there onwards we find the role of Zainab. Then on the other hand, you see how propaganda machinery used to work at that time. It was not much different. In today's time we have technology, and we used to have news media. It used to take a couple of minutes for information to disseminate or propagate. Now we have Twitter. So you say something and the tweet goes on and everybody knows what is going on. Alright? So but the propagation of lies was exactly the way it is promoted and propagated by those self-centered institutions and nations who are promoting their own cause. Today also we find. And that was the case during the time of Yazid. Yazid wanted to convince people that the person who was killed in Karbala with his companions was one of the Khawarij, one of those rebellious ones. And therefore we killed him and we wiped him out so that he does not bring discord and dissension in the Ummah of Rasulullah. This was the propagation of Bani Umayyah. And Ahl al-Bayt had no means. The enemies of Islam, in the form of Bani Umayyah, were promoting this message even before Ahl al-Bayt could get there. And Ahl al-Bayt were prisoners, they were victims, and they did not have any voice. Their men were killed. But there was one woman who withstood all the hardships and all the calamities, and she stood for righteousness, and she ensured that the people are made aware who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed, who is zalim and who is mazloom. Hazrat Zainab Salamullah Alaiha took every opportunity possible to ensure that she could tell the people what the true story is. And this takes strength. This takes bravery. This takes conviction. This takes that reliance and trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now if we are the followers, our women, our daughters, our sisters should also be taught this value. Because bravery does not mean that you have to be brave and have a sword in your hand to go and fight in the battlefield. Bravery is that you are not shattered, you are not hopeless, you are not losing hope in your own convictions and in your own beliefs, and you persuade and you're sure of what you're doing, and you withstand the hardships that come with it. And Hazrat Zainab Salamullah Alaiha demonstrated that. Hazrat Zainab informed people while the propaganda machinery of Bani Umayyah was in full swing, going and trying to convince people that these were a bunch of Khawarij. However, Zainab turned the tables around them to such an extent that Bani Umayyah could not stay too long in power. And it was all the work of Zainab. It was Zainab who ensured. Now the other thing, what do the oppressors do? The other thing that the oppressors do is that they instill fear. That is how they prevail. When there is, those who are seeking power, those who are seeking leadership, and that power and that leadership is not divine, one of the criteria or one of the measures or one of the means of knowing how they do it is you should see whether they are using excessive force, whether they are using zulm as a means to ride on power. And Yazid was doing the same thing. There was excessive zulm, there was oppression, there was this fear that was being instilled into the hearts of everyone who was there, so that nobody else could dare come out and be bold enough, be brave enough to stand up against the tyrant of the time. And we find Hazrat Zainab and surrounded by all the disadvantages one can think of, that she was once the daughter of Khalifa, lived in Kufa with Amirul Mu'mineen. Now she is being brought into Kufa as a prisoner, and she is being humiliated as a prisoner, and her brothers and their bodies have been desecrated in Karbala, and their heads have been raised on spears, and they do not have veils. How much depressed a woman should have been? How should a woman react to such a situation? And then she is brought as a prisoner in front of the governor of Kufa, Ibn Ziyad Lanatullah alayh. And Ibn Ziyad is happy, and he is in pride, filled with pride, and trying to ridicule Ahl al-Bayt, and also do that at the cost of Allah. He was trying to show that all of this that has happened to you, O Zainab, and to your family has come from Allah. And what does Zainab say? In all these hardships, Zainab say, I have not seen anything. Ma ra'aytu illa jamila. I have not seen anything except beauty from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. She is thankful for what Allah has given her and her family, and she is proud to show Ibn Ziyad that you are not privileged. I am the one who is privileged. I am the one in whose house Wahi comes and goes. The angels come and goes. The revelation comes and goes. We are Ahl al-Bayt. You are not Ahl al-Bayt. Allah has honored us. Allah has given us this privilege. Hazrat Zainab is standing from the point of courage and strength, while Ibn Ziyad was showing his tyranny, his anger. Anybody who would raise his head in front of Ibn Ziyad, he would cut it off right then and there. But we do not find Hazrat Zainab being, even for a moment, scared. Why? Because she was brave. She was daughter of Amirul Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib. Please say salawat.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Now, if we look at Quran and how Quran present those who are truly from Allah, we will find that Quran talks very, very highly about them. Inna awliya Allah la khawfun alayhim wa lahum yahzanun. That awliya Allah, the friends of Allah, do not have any fear in them, nor do they grieve. And Zainab is the manifestation of being that friend of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I mean, I do not have time to talk about Amirul Mu'mineen, how awliya Allah, the others, but I'm trying to show that those who put their trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Quran testifies that they do not possess any fear nor any grief. And Zainab was the manifestation of the ayah of Holy Quran when she was standing in front of Ibn Ziyad and talking to him. Now it does not stop here. You should see the courage that Zainab demonstrates when she is going into the court of Yazid. How courageously she confronts. But before that, let me give you a brief discussion or description of the meaning tolaqa. Who are tolaqa? What is the meaning of tolaqa? Tolaqa, in general, when you look at them, the meaning that is described is one who is freed unconditionally. There are many meanings. I'm going to quickly go one by one. The first one is الَّذِينَ أُدْخِلُوا فِي الْإِسْلَامِ كَرْحًا. Those who entered Islam with despise. They had no other choice, so they entered Islam. They are tolaqa. Okay? Or if you look into the dictionary meaning of talaq, talaq means to set free or to withdraw from any commitment or any promise. To set somebody free unconditionally. There are no conditions. There are no conditions attached to it. Setting someone free. These are called tolaqa. And then there are examples of how the dictionary would use that meaning. And this is mutlaq, which comes meaning absolute, meaning unconditional, absolute. When you think of something, we call it mutlaq. These are all coming from tolaqa. So tolaqa are those who have come into the fold of Islam while they were not willing to enter. When did this happen? This happened when the Prophet of Allah entered the city of Mecca and attained the final and the grand victory of Mecca. When the grand victory of Mecca took place, the Prophet of Allah enters Mecca, and at that time, those kuffar and mushrikeen, those disbelievers, whose leader was Abu Sufyan, the grandfather of Yazid, he sees that he has no way out of what the Prophet of Allah is bringing. The army that the Prophet of Allah has camped outside of Mecca was no match, or they could not, the kuffar of Quraysh could never match the army that the Prophet has brought from Medina. So now he calls upon Abbas, the uncle of the Holy Prophet, and submits himself. Okay? And when the Prophet of Allah comes into Mecca, he uses compassion and mercy that the Prophet had and frees everybody. And he says, Izhabu antumut tolaqa. Go, I have set you free. You are tolaqa. You were set free. If you look at the battle of Badr, when there was a battle, when Islam prevailed and it did get the prisoners, there were options, whether you give the blood money or you will have to free yourself, you have to give the blood money. If you are knowledgeable, if you are literate, you have to go and teach Muslims, 10 Muslims. There was a price attached to it. And that was the rules of engagement of that time. However, in the victory of Makkah, the Prophet of Allah unconditionally freed them without any condition. So everyone who was in Mecca was a freed slave of Islam, whom the Prophet of Allah had freed without any conditions. These were the people who were called tolaqa. And this terminology gained prominence and people were aware of who tolaqa were. Now let me give you an example of a hadith in which we find that Abdullah ibn Sa'd bin Abi Sarhin, this was the brother of Uthman bin Affan through nursing, through drinking the milk from the same woman. And this person accepted Islam, and then he comes to the Holy Prophet And when the Prophet starts reciting verses of Holy Quran, he would start writing the verses. However, he would record them incorrectly. He would not record them correctly. So the Prophet asked him not to record the verses because of that. And later on, he turns against Islam and moves from Medina back to Mecca, and he becomes murtad. So he becomes an apostate. So when the Prophet entered Mecca and the victory of Mecca occurred, the Prophet of Allah did free everyone, but there were some people whom the Prophet of Allah had not given the free chit, and this guy was one of those. However, Uthman bin Affan, after the victory of Mecca, brings him into the company of the Holy Prophet and says, please forgive him. Please forgive him. And the Prophet of Allah is not responding. Until 3 times the Prophet of Allah does not respond, and finally the Prophet says, okay, he is for you, take him from here and leave. And they both leave. And when they leave, the Prophet turned around to his companions and he says, don't you know he was an apostate? Don't you know what was the price of an apostate? What you should have done? They say, oh yeah, Prophet of Allah, we knew. And one of them, who was tall, gets up and he says, you should have just given us some hint with your eye, with the blink of your eye, and then we would have, taken care of him. And the Prophet of Allah says that we, the prophets, do not do things like this. You knew what the ruling was, you should have taken care of him. And the hadith, the riwayah I said, was to tell you that فَكَانَ مِنَ الطُّلَقَى. He was also from Tulaqa. So Tulaqa is the terminology that has been used quite often. Then another place where another narration, this is in reference to one of the wives of the Holy Prophet, to whom a person comes and says, aren't you amazed? She's talking about the father of Yazid, and he says, aren't you amazed that today there are Tulaqa who are fighting for the station of Khilafah? Aren't you amazed at this? That the Tulaqa are fighting from the companions, Ashab of Rasulullah, for the station of Khilafah, referring to the father of Yazid. And the wife of the Holy Prophet responds by saying, Allah, when He wants to give something to somebody, He gives to a good person and also to a fajr, a transgressor. And don't you see that Allah has given power and to Fir'aun for 400 years? If Allah wishes, He can give power even to kuffar. Okay, so here also there is this discussion of Tulaqa. So in the Islamic world, there was this category of people who became Muslims after the victory of Mecca, and they were called Tulaqa. And when this person confronts Amirul Mu'mineen tells him, Amirul Mu'mineen also tells him the same thing, that you are striving to become a Khalifa, however, Khilafah is haram on Tulaqa. Amirul Mu'mineen says this. It is recorded in history. Shari ibn Abil Hadid al-Mu'tazali, he records it, and it is also there that you are from Tulaqa and you are aspiring for Khilafah, being said for the father of Yazid. And here also, so this category of Tulaqa, my dear brothers and sisters, of freed slaves was quite popular. And now imagine Yazid is sitting on the throne that he did not own, and filled with pride, he is calling upon his ancestors from Badr and telling that, where are you? There was no wahi. The Prophet only declared, there was no revelation. Come and see what I have made of Bani Hashim. He is filled with pride and talking, and in front is Hazrat Zainab Salamullah alayha. And the court is filled with people. And the fear of Yazid and his oppression was such that anybody who would raise his head would be killed and would be dealt with immediately. And there are so many instances in the history, even during while Hazrat Zainab was there. When people stood up, they were taken on the side and they were killed. Under such circumstances, under such fear and under such oppression, when Zainab stands up, she calls Yazid, when Yazid is trying to brag about who he is and how he has prevailed, Hazrat Zainab says, Yabnat Talakha, you are the son of a freed one. You're talking to me? Your servants are behind the veil and you bring the daughters of Rasulullah in front in the court? O you son of the freed slave, how much courage one would need to use these words. Because all Yazid had to do was make one signal and there would be bloodshed all over. However, we find that Hazrat Zainab Salamullahi alayha has demonstrated her bravery and she showed what Imam Hussein stood for. My dear brothers and sisters, this is the value that we need to teach our children. This is the value that we all have to hold on to and not submit ourselves to the calamities and hardships of the time and try to justify saying, we are in America, this is no more, I'm not living in a Muslim country where I can practice my religion. What can I do when I'm here? I have no other choice, but I have to do this, I have to do that. These are all excuses. If we are brave enough, if we are courageous enough, this is one of the places where we can practice our religion with a sense of pride, with a sense of honor and dignity. Let shaitan do not deviate us from the path of Sirat-e-Mustaqim. When we have role models such as Hazrat Zainab Salamullah alayha, and she's not just a role model for women, but for also us. Having that conviction and that belief, Hazrat Zainab Salamullah alayha stands up because she is the daughter of Wali of Allah. And she herself has the wilayah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why we find Hazrat Zainab is not shaken by the oppressor of the time. And she looks into the eye of oppression and calls him, O son of freed slave, you are talking to me. This is what Hazrat Zainab Salamullah alayha is. Please say salawat. And when on the day of Ashura you see Zainab in a completely different face. I was looking at this book, which is a speech of Shaheed Musa Sadr. He talks about the life of Hazrat Zainab, and which he was narrating a tradition where he says that on the day of Ashura, after Ashura was completed, Hazrat Zainab arrives at the body of Imam Hussein. And she stands there, and then she looks at the body of Imam Hussein, and the body is filled with arrows and swords and spears. She separates all of them from the body of her brother Imam Hussein, and then she holds the body of Imam Hussein in her hands and looks up into the sky, and then she says, "Oh Allah, accept our sacrifice. Taqabbal minna. Oh Allah, accept this sacrifice from us for the sake of Islam." So you see, my dear brothers and sisters, this is who Zainab is. This is what Islam teaches us. When it comes to Allah, we show our humility. When it comes to Allah, we show how weak we are and how committed we are for His command. But when it comes to the enemies of Islam, Hazrat Zainab has the courage to look into the eyes of oppression and call them names that they would be embarrassed about and what they truly represented, she would call them with those names. This is a great woman who lived her life and who lived for a cause, and it gives us great inspiration to truly follow the footsteps of Hazrat Zainab Salamullah alayha. And on this blessed birth of Hazrat Zainab, I would ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He inspire us and our children and our sisters and our women to walk on the footsteps of Hazrat Zainab Salamullah alayha. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect the life and property and honor and dignity of believers wherever they are. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the reappearance of the Imam of our time. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us such that the Imam of our time would be pleased with us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive the person, the brother who has passed away of his sin, Sayyid Amir Shah Hassan Yar, and mahshur him with Ahlul Bayt. Please recite the Surah Fatiha again for the soul of this brother. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.